Hi, this is Jan Hodis. I'm with the client organization at Ipsos, leading the healthcare services research practice. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Building Better Insights Around COVID Vaccines. Today's presentation is going to be given by our team of public opinion and healthcare research experts. And throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, you may submit questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session, but if time does run short, then your questions will be answered by email. I would also encourage you to check out the handouts that are uploaded in the webinar console. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. And now I'd like to just say a word or two about the data sources and introduce today's speaker. So the sources of data that we'll be presenting today come from a variety of research that we've been involved in, including both internal syndicated research, among both providers and consumers and other stakeholders, but also data that we've collected specifically for public release. So let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Natalie Lacey. She's our Chief Research Officer for Ipsos Global Affairs. And then Jackie Alakwa. Jackie is president of our Global Healthcare Syndicated Practice. And then Rhoda Smecking, who is the head of our Virology and Vaccine Center of Excellence. We've got a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to Rhoda right now.
Thank you very much, Jan, and welcome everyone. So thank you, Jan, and welcome everyone. So since the start of this pandemic was declared in March 2020, we've seen 109 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, 41 million of these confirmed since mid-December. And in the last 24 hours, there has been 332,000 newly reported cases globally, and it's impacting all countries, all industries, and all walks of life. In the US alone, there has been 27.4 million cases reported, representing 8% of the US population. In fact, we are near 490,000 deaths in the US alone due to COVID-19. Looking at our syndicated therapy monitor data that Ipsos collects, we see that the incidence of COVID-19 is lower in certain vulnerable populations in the US. This indicates to us that these people are taking all precautions needed to limit their exposure to the virus. These are people that are suffering from multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, severe asthma, and 2% of patients with cancer. In the US, the perceived threat of COVID-19 among citizens has remained consistently high for a year since the start of the pandemic in March 2020. And how citizens rate the threat to them personally, the threat to their job, business, the threat to their country has remained remarkably consistent, with the exception of that small dip that you see in November, which was at the time of the US election. The crisis threatens to outlive the virus itself. Most citizens believe COVID-19 will have a long-lasting health and economic effect on society. And we can see that the US here, US citizens, it's very consistent across the other markets that we're tracking, and this has been consistently so since we began tracking this. This month, we ran a survey amongst healthcare professionals for our own purposes in the UK, France, and the US. We asked the doctors when they believe the pandemic will be resolved. It's interesting to see that the UK doctors are expecting it to take longer than their counterparts in France and the US. Nearly 1 in 4 UK doctors expect it'll be more than 2 years. But overall, indeed, we see that over 70% of the healthcare professionals that we talk to think it will take at least a year to resolve this pandemic. All hopes are pinned on a vaccine, and pharma has moved with unprecedented speed to move the vaccine through clinical trials safely, while simultaneously ramping up production on the chance of success. Overall, we have 299 COVID-19 vaccine candidates in development, an increase of 26 since mid-December. 76 are in clinical testing, 20 in late-stage clinical trials, that's phase 3, and 10 are being used across the globe currently to protect the population. These vaccine clinical trials and rollouts are the most watched and followed healthcare news or any pharma-related news products ever. There are constant headlines about efficacy rates, dosing, production, and administration, and household names have been made of companies like Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, J&J, Novavax. Indeed, the general population have become experts in terms of clinical trials and efficacy rates associated with these vaccines. But the COVID-19 vaccine development process is far from typical. So for a typical vaccine development, you're looking at roughly about 10 years to develop. What's happened with the COVID-19 vaccine development is a medical science miracle in the fact that we have vaccines available 1 year after the start of this pandemic. We've been asking and tracking over a couple of waves how comfortable doctors are with how quickly vaccines are being approved and made available across the globe. And as these vaccines become available, we see that healthcare providers across a number of markets, that their level of comfort has grown from wave 1, when we asked them in October, to wave 2, when we asked them in December. And we're just analysing the data for wave 3 now, and we expect to see that trend continuing.
Great, thank you very much, Rhoda. I'm going to talk a little bit now about how public opinion is evolving and really some of the remarkable shifts we're seeing in terms of opinion in the US and indeed around the world. And what was started as an issue around vaccine hesitancy, and of course remains a critical part of our analysis, we're also seeing a lot of issues around equity and around distribution. So we're looking at not only what happens when people are eligible to get the vaccine, but how they feel about when they will have access and the type of hesitancy that will exist when they actually have the right to actually receive the vaccine. This data is from January 31st, so very recent, and you can see along the side just the scope of change in opinion over the space of 1 month. We're seeing double-digit, in fact, 20-plus point increases in some countries in terms of willingness, stated willingness to get the vaccine. We also see very high numbers in terms of total agree across the board, slightly lower due to historical reasons in France, Japan, and Russia. So as I said, there's really 2 different equity and distribution issues that we're tracking. One is the perception of who should get the vaccine within a country. And you can see here, this is the US data in terms of belief of who should actually receive the vaccine in terms of priority, ranging from people who act as caregivers, then onto police and law enforcement, and slightly farther down the list, some of the other different groups that we tested. So there's a lot of differentiation, and I will say as we tested this globally, a lot of variance in terms of how people feel the vaccine should be distributed within the country. The other issue then is global distribution and equity, and whether or not countries should take excess doses, even if other countries may not be able to receive what they need to start vaccinations now. And you can see the dark bar here, a real wide set of variances across the countries. You can see the US with only 1 in 3 saying that the country should buy excess doses at the expense of other countries. So one of the key issues, of course, around hesitancy, and as we showed at the start, there's a variety of different types of hesitancy. It could be altruistic hesitancy, historical hesitancy, but we also track whether or not there's messages that are out in the public that may impact people's willingness to get the vaccine. So about 3 in 10 in the US, again, this is from late January, say that they've actually heard discouraging messages advising against getting the vaccine. However, of that group that have actually seen these messages, only 1 in 3 say it actually impacts their likelihood of receiving the vaccine when they have the opportunity to do so. So we then looked at different regulatory options, including whether government should impose restrictions on anti-vaccination messages. And you can see here again the wide variation across the country set, but nearly a majority in the US supporting restrictions that would actually limit the messaging or the advertising associated with anti-vaccination messages. We also, from an opinion standpoint, look at trust and who is most credible to speak about the safety and effectiveness of a vaccine. And you can see, again, wide range in terms of the different groups that were tested, with physicians being at the top, 3 and 4 saying that they have trust in their physician. Moving down, as you see in the middle, regulatory bodies and the World Health Organization, and media falling to the bottom of the list. And again, these are results for the US. So overall, we've looked at various drivers of willingness to get the vaccine. And you can see the model that we have here. This is something that's proprietary to Ipsos. We call it our Ipsos Bayes nets. And it looks at not only the relationship against likelihood, but actually the relationship among the different factors and how they cluster together. And this is really insightful because it allows us to look at the different elements and the different factors that drive that measure of likelihood. And you can see the 4 different groupings that we've developed based on this analysis. So, of course, messages that focus on safety and efficacy impact likelihood. There's messages around whether this is normal behavior, something I've done in the past. We've looked a lot at the issue of moral obligation, social responsibility, and we know that regret is one of the core measures of willingness to get a vaccine, and that clearly is coming out in terms of one of the drivers. And then there's a really interesting point about confidence in the decision. And as Rhoda said, there's a lot of information that people are taking in, and the confidence in someone's decision and whether they feel like they need more information is also emerging as one of the key driver sets. So we want to just take a minute and actually go beyond the data and look a little bit at the emotions associated with the vaccine, because we know that this is beyond just the practical. So one of the things that Ipsos offers is an ethnography center. And I'm going to take the opportunity to show you a video that we produced through the ethnography center. The participants have actually agreed to have this video shown. If you're on your phone, you might not hear the audio. It comes through the computer. And I do advise that it's about 3 minutes, and we'll join you back with Jackie in the presentation upon the completion of this video. So I'm hoping that everyone can see this and we can proceed.
So I'm feeling a little bit emotional. I just got this from my mum. And I just can't quite believe it. It's amazing.
There's a beautiful, I'm in my loft and there's a beautiful cloud with a silver lining over there. And suddenly it feels like everything is possible, you know, now that my mum's got her vaccination. It opens up a lot of different things. What we're doing today.
I'm like, well, we're going to go for my COVID vaccination. I'm so excited.
What was your response when you got the text?
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that I'd been chosen. And then I phoned all my neighbours who also go to the same surgery as me. I mean, Fenya says that she's very scared. She's quite scared. I'm not scared at all. I'm used to jabs.
No.
You know, I'm not scared at all.
Does it feel like
Bring
a magic...
it on. That's what I want.
Bring it on. Do you feel like a magic bullet, though?
Yes, it is. It's a miracle, isn't it, that we've got it?
Well, anyway, I think we should go.
Okay, let's go.
Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
yourself?
This is my daughter.
She's so pleased for you.
Come for the coronavirus vaccine?
Yes.
We're giving you the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca one.
Good.
You get 2 doses, one you'll get today and one in 12 weeks' time.
Yeah.
You get the best protection after 12 weeks.
Okay.
For the time being, you need to keep following all the rules about wearing a mask, staying at home and social distancing.
Okay. You're saving my life.
It's great news.
Thank you.
Great, isn't it?
Thank you very much.
Good, that's you done.
Good. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Very brave.
Welcome.
It's a big needle.
It is, isn't it?
I know, I've seen it on the television. It really goes in quite deeply, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Muscle.
I know, that's what I want to know. Thank you.
Hey, how do you feel?
Oh, fine. Really good.
Excited.
I'm not going to die.
This is it. This is the one. Fantastic, Mum. This is like gold dust.
I know.
That means you can travel. How do you feel psychologically now?
Oh, great relief. Really, a really great relief. And it'll be so good when everybody else gets it done.
Exactly. One feeling for yourself and one feeling for society, don't you? Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for taking the time to view that with us. And I'm going to hand it over to Jackie.
Thanks so much, Natalie. That was an amazing video. And we've also recently done a study with 3,683 vaccinated citizens in the United States. And what we found is that 99.5% of them have had their second dose scheduled at the time that they got their first dose, and only a small half of a percentage were scheduling their second dose through the telephone. We did also ask them about how to improve the vaccination process, and they said things like improving the ability to social distance. So sometimes the lines to get the vaccines are a little bit too close together, or the signage to figure out exactly where you're going isn't exactly as clear as it could be. They also talked about offering better options close to home. Some people are traveling quite far to get their vaccine. And then again, confirming the second dose appointments with patients so that they don't forget that they have to get their second dose and when they should get it. So there'll be many changes in healthcare as a result of the pandemic. And, you know, Natalie touched on that a little bit before. People think there will be changes, and there will be. And there'll be a lot of, you know, positive changes as well. So we asked doctors in a recent study what they thought the likelihood of patients was to get other vaccines for other diseases as a result of COVID. And what we see in the US, in the UK, and France is that the majority of physicians believe that patients are going to be more willing now to get other vaccinations. And we see that most strongly in France. We've also seen, by looking at our global therapy monitor data, the use of telemedicine or virtual health visits increasing. So about 1 in 5 of our US-based RA, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and MS patients had their most recent visit with their specialist using telemedicine. 1 in 4 severe asthma patients were seen virtually. And even in cancer, you know, back in the height of the, you know, kind of lock-in here in the United States, in May, about 1/3 of cancer patients conducted their visits through telemedicine. It declined, and then we saw it rise again in Q4. But if you remember, with cancer patients, you know, for the most part, they need to be going into the office or into the hospital to get their treatment. But we do think that this change in telemedicine and virtual health is something that we're going to see moving forward. Sorry. There remains concern, though, among physicians about the new strains of COVID-19. So in the study that we just conducted, we asked physicians how concerned they are about these new strains. And what we see is that more than half of the doctors are somewhat or are very or extremely concerned, with the most concern, again, coming in France. Three of 4 US-based citizens have also heard of the new virus strains and variants, and about half think that vaccines will be effective against them. And while vaccines are really front and center right now, and that's what we've been spending a lot of time talking about, we also asked physicians about treatments, and they agree that these treatments are also going to play a role, almost an equal role, especially amidst the rise in the new strains. And you can see here, again, with the exception of the UK, where 35% of physicians think that they're equally or more important, we see more than half of the doctors in France and the US who think treatments are equally or more important than vaccines. I think that it's interesting to see the number slightly lower in the UK, but we have to focus on the fact that the UK is really so focused and has been much more focused, much quicker on vaccinations than some of the other countries. But I think there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. And for some of those questions, really only time is going to tell. So when we think about how well are vaccines going to work to limit the spread of the virus, and how well will they work to prevent transmission as well as infection, or to help the reopening of society, which is a huge question for everyone, and now to protect against the new strains. And, you know, we're seeing some evidence that they're protecting against new strains, but there's still questions out there. Time will also tell how the pandemic is going to impact timelines for drug development. So, you know, Rhoda talked about how quickly the COVID vaccine was developed. It went from 10 years down to 1 year. At the same time, will other drugs be developed quicker? Or will there actually be a delay because maybe there weren't the right people ready for a clinical trial during the highest parts of the pandemic? How will the pandemic impact potential incentives for vaccinations? Will people be incentivized to get vaccinations? Will they be required to get vaccinations in order to travel or go back to work? Will research approaches for potential viral threats change? Are we going to be more active looking at them before? Because we never thought this could happen again to the extent that we've seen COVID-19 affect the world. There's certain treatments right now that are only used inpatient. Will we see a shift to be able to use those outpatient? That's the case with some of the COVID-19 treatments right now where you need to be inpatient to get them. Will that change? And will the approach to diagnosing and testing change for future viruses? I mean, we saw widespread COVID-19 testing. Is that going to be the new norm for COVID-19 and any other virus, flu, any other virus out there? But there's many questions that Ipsos can answer right now, and we've shown just a little bit in this webinar some of the data that we have that answers the questions. What is the impact on patient treatment and treatment approaches? We know that certain patients have been delaying their treatments. We know that some of their treatment selections have been changed so that they're less frequent and don't have to come into the office more. And we have that information from some of our internal syndicated work and our global therapy monitors. What proportion of the population is willing to get vaccinated, by when, and what is driving hesitancy? Natalie just talked about that, and we have a lot more information on that. How will patients interact with physicians post-COVID-19, and will the approaches to their own healthcare change? We talked a little bit about the use of telemedicine and virtual health, and we talked about the fact that patients are more likely to get vaccines for other conditions now moving forward. What can governments, the medical community, and the healthcare industry do to help healthcare professionals and patients during this time? There's a lot of information that we have available on that, and we have a lot of methodologies to gather that information. How has the treatment landscape changed? And has COVID-19 driven the changes seen? Again, it goes down to treatment, diagnosing. Are patients being diagnosed as quickly as they were in the past? Are they getting the same types of treatments? virtual conferences. If you've ever been to a medical conference, and I've been fortunate enough to be to a lot of them, you know, the whole approach to walking the halls and walking through an exhibit hall and reading posters and sitting in lectures, it's now online, it's now virtual. So what do the doctors think about that? And we have quite a bit of information on that. How has COVID-19 impacted patients' access to treatments and how they receive it? And when do consumers and healthcare professionals expect to return to our new normal? That's the big question that everybody's been asking. Will more people get vaccinated for other conditions? We've already talked a little bit about that. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it is becoming brighter every single day. We said in the beginning that we're all in this together. COVID-19 has affected more than 100 million people worldwide, 8% of the US population, and its impact and implications are widespread. There's not one of us sitting on this call today who hasn't been impacted in some way by what's happened in the last year. Vaccines are viewed as the way out, although treatments are recognized by physicians as equally important to vaccines. And we're starting to capture information on COVID-19 treatments, and we'll be tracking that moving forward. And it'll be really interesting to see the combination of vaccinations and effective treatments and the impact that has on eradicating the virus. While vaccine demand is currently outweighing supply, there's still hesitant segments of the population which need to be addressed. And Natalie talked about that. There's lots of different reasons for hesitancy, and we need to find the right way to communicate with people in order to address that hesitancy. Physicians are going to play a critical role in vaccine recommendation. They're the most trusted source. Natalie showed that slide about how trusted they are, and their recommendation to get a vaccine goes a long way. And while vaccines and treatments are moving us in the right direction, there does remain concern about the new strains. And again, that's something that only time will tell, although we gather information from both consumers and physicians as to what they think about the new strains. But most importantly, everything that's happened will lead to increased innovation in disease discovery, drug development, access, knowledge, and distribution. One virus which caused so much pain will lead to so much progress for our generation, future generations. And so there is, again, light at the end of the tunnel, and it is becoming brighter every day. We have a lot of information on COVID-19. We have a lot of information about the pandemic, about the impact on businesses, on societies, on people. We have a lot of information about vaccines, a lot of information about treatments in the general healthcare market, as well as treatments for COVID-19. And we've written a lot of white papers. So I would encourage you to go and download some of the white papers that we've written. Reach out to us with any questions that you have. Again, we're sitting on a wealth of data, finding it amazingly interesting, and it's changing, every day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan, who can take us through some of the questions that have popped up through the webinar. So thanks so much, Jan.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you, all of our speakers today. I would encourage those of you who might have questions to use your chat feature and go ahead and submit those questions, but I do already have a handful here. So let me read them out, and you guys can decide who's best equipped to answer them, okay? Here's the first one. You mentioned that treatments are equally important as vaccines. Do you have any information about that? Is that one for you, Rhoda?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of development that's going on, and a lot of products or a lot of assets in clinical trials for COVID-19 treatment. And it's a very fluid area. So we are collecting quite detailed information in terms of how patients are being diagnosed with COVID-19, what their journey is to seeing a physician, those patients that are being treated in a hospital setting, those patients that are being treated as outpatients, and then also understanding a very important group, which are called long COVID or long haulers, and understanding how doctors are following those patients and how they're treating those patients as well. And so that's a very interesting, very evolving area. We have data on this in the US at the moment and expanding that to other markets. But yeah, it's a fascinating area. Lots to do there.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question, which I think probably should go to Natalie. You're still with us, Natalie. I don't see your picture. But this is about the hesitant group of people. What changes are you seeing over time with this group, and what are the trigger points that might convert them to get a vaccine?
Thanks, Jan. And this is a really important question, right? Because as I said, that right now when we're in a period where in some ways there's an anxiety of when someone will be eligible, we also still have to maintain that focus on hesitancy and addressing hesitancy so that when people are eligible, they take advantage, and when there is a supply available, that people are actually getting over this hesitancy. So as I said, the shift in opinion has been really remarkable. I mean, to see those kind of 20-point swings over the space of 3 or 4 weeks is really something significant, and the scope across countries. There are also different, as we talked about, different types of hesitancy. So there's clearly a group that we believe can be influenced in terms of conveying the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, conveying how it will have a long-term impact. And what's interesting is we looked at the reasons why people would get a vaccine, and actually less than a majority say it's for them personally. There is a group that say it's for people around me, and there's a group that feel that it's their social responsibility to get it. So also building on those two factors, the potential risks, and as I said, that concept of regret, which is really important in terms of driving willingness, can be also factors that influence hesitancy and encourage people to overcome their hesitancy and actually get the vaccine when they're available.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that's a follow-up to that, Natalie. I don't know if you want to weigh in on this, but it's very similar to the first. In communicating about the importance of getting the COVID-19 vaccination, what are the pros and cons of emphasizing the altruistic motives, like keeping family members or co-workers safe, versus focusing on preventing the illness for oneself? Do you have any sense of how to weigh those up?
Well, as I said, the numbers that we're seeing put probably about 2/3 on, let's say 1/3 on society, 1/3 on those around me, and 1/3 on personal. So when it actually comes down to it, we believe the personal will actually probably play a slightly higher role, when you're actually at the point of, scheduling an appointment. But clearly in terms of the messages and the importance that it means to society, but in particular also what it means for being able to return to normal. And just related, we're also testing things like mandatory vaccinations, right? So should an employer make vaccinations mandatory? And in terms of some of those issues, it starts to get a little bit more divided in terms of opinions. Mm-hmm. So there really is a desire for people to feel that social responsibility and not necessarily have it as a regulated or mandated activity.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of information coming out around this. I know some people are asking, is there going to need to be a passport, essentially, an immunization passport in order to get on a flight or to go to a concert or go, to the movie theater, things like that. So I think there's going to be a lot more.
And really significant differences, I mean, of course, by countries, but also within groups, so we have to recognize that this is not a unified issue. Mm-hmm. And we know that there's demographic groups and different racial groups that are going to have different motivations that need to be addressed as well. And, so also recognizing the variation that exists and the types of hesitancy, but also how those play with different groups in society is really important.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you very much. Okay, I have a couple more questions here. You mentioned that incidence in the most vulnerable populations is lower than the general population. Do you have any other information about how their treatment was modified, or if it was at all, as a result of COVID? I'm thinking this goes to you, Jackie.
Oh, that's fine. Thanks, Pat. So I was saying earlier that in our global therapy monitors, which we run in over 30 different disease areas, we capture patient record information. So we understand about the patients and about what treatments that they're getting. And in the beginning of the pandemic, we looked at adding in questions about whether the treatment was being influenced or was impacted by COVID-19. So if it was a new patient and they selected a treatment for that patient, was that was that impacted by COVID-19? So for example, if it was a cancer patient and maybe, they had an option for an oral or an IV therapy, were they picking an oral at least initially to postpone time between visits? So we have information about that. We've been able to track information and see any shifts in the types of treatment that's been used for patients. We also understand vaccinations among that group. So not only do we know, what percentage of cancer patients, as Rhoda said, or MS patients have had COVID, we'll also be tracking them moving forward for vaccinations, for treatments, and also for switching. So if they switched off of a particular product, was that related to COVID itself? So we have a fair amount of information around that.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Let's see. Here's one I think would go to Rhoda. Any idea what the uptake rates are for the COVID vaccination among physicians themselves? Or so I guess any healthcare providers.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd be surprised to know that we've been tracking that as well with our COVID-19 vaccine study with HCPs, pharmacists, as well as consumers. And we're doing that across 18 markets worldwide. And the vast majority of doctors are comfortable and they want to get vaccinated. And we can see that growing across the waves, but there is a cohort that have some concern or do not want to take that. So it will be interesting to see how that changes as the vaccines are rolled out and there's more data out there about it and more experience with it as well. But yeah, it's a key point that we're tracking.
Yeah, there's such a linchpin in trying to get the general population to consider the vaccination that what they're actually doing, I think, is going to have a big impact. So yeah, good to understand that. What role do you see social media playing in being either an advocate or an opponent of vaccination? And I think that's one for Natalie.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Indeed, so as you know, at the start of the vaccination process, some of the social media platforms put processes in place for managing messages that are either discouraging or explicit anti-vaccination. And what was interesting from the data is I showed you the data for government regulating. The numbers for actually social media imposing those regulations is actually very similar to government. So those same sort of figures in terms of whether or not social media should play a role exist across the country. So that was about 1 in 2 in the US supporting social media actually taking that responsibility. So again, we know that people are seeing some messages. They're seeing messages on a variety of platforms. Clearly, social media has a role to play. And, it's interesting because we ran a perils study, what we call perils of perception. And what we show is that people believe that social media influences everyone else, but not themselves. So 70% think that it influences everyone else, but only 30% think it influences them. So clearly, in terms of whether or not people actually believe it's impacting their opinions, we have yet to see a demonstration or acknowledgement that that's the case. So, clearly there's a role for the platforms given their propensity and their prevalence in society. I think that people are searching for a variety of different sources and still turn to physicians as the most trusted source.
Okay, very good. I think, and unless people have any closing remarks, I think that winds us down. Anything final? I guess what I'll just let our participants know is that we will be sending out a link so that you can find some of these white papers that we've published and also get a recording of today's session. So if you have registered for this, we'll be sending that out. We'd love to hear from you if you have questions, if you have additional things that occur to you later. Be very happy to try to address those for all of you. Thank you for your time today, and thank you to all of our speakers. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.